This is discussion 9A. In fact, it's the only discussion. I'll do the whole thing on this one. I want to step back for a minute. We've talked about the Han Dynasty. We've talked about the Roman Empire. I want to step back for a minute now and do a comparison. This is one of the things that historians do is they can't ever run experiments in history. You can't say I'm going to run the Roman Empire 10 times and change one variable each time. You've just got the one Roman Empire to look at. And so if you're looking for larger rules or patterns in history, one of the best ways to do that is to compare similar things and see if you can figure out what the similar things were and what's different between them, and if this tells us why things happened. So I want to step back for a second. I want to look at the Han Dynasty in China and the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. And these two were pretty much contemporaneous. The sort of heyday of the Roman Republic corresponded to the early Han Dynasty. The heyday of the Roman Empire corresponded to the late Han Dynasty. And they both had periods of chaos in the middle, right around the first century BCE and then into the first century CE. And so I want to do a comparison. And if you look at the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire, you'll see that there are some real similarities in what caused them to collapse. So I want to talk about the factors in their collapse. One of the first is growing economic inequality, that essentially both the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire saw an upper class that got wealthier and wealthier and a lower class that was getting poorer and poorer. Okay? And so the economic disparity between the wealthy and the poor grew over time. And in Rome, of course, as we saw, this was the patricians who owned big swaths of land, and then the plebeians who were small landowners or people who didn't own land at all. And we saw that this led to the Gracchus brothers trying to do their reforms in the 2nd century BCE and then being assassinated, and then Gaius Marius and the Julius Caesar appealing to plebeians to try to seize power for themselves. And eventually that this led to the formation of the Roman Empire as a way of handling the dissatisfaction of the plebeians. And I want to point out that one of the key problems that'll come up later is that the patricians generally didn't want to be taxed themselves. They wanted to tax the plebeians. In the Han Dynasty, a similar dynamic is happening. There are aristocratic families who own big swaths of land, and they rent that land out as landlords to peasants who are tenant farmers. And there is increasing pressure in the early Han Dynasty from peasants who hated paying high taxes and resented that they couldn't get land for themselves and that these wealthy families just owned all the land. And this sort of culminates in 9 CE when Wang Mang takes over the Han Dynasty, and he begins essentially a massive land reform program. He starts seizing land from wealthy aristocratic families and breaking it up and handing out in small parcels to peasants. And this is his big program, is he's going to simply redistribute all the land in China from the wealthy families to the poor. But it leads to total chaos. First of all, there's all sorts of resistance from the wealthy aristocrats. In the first place, they don't like this. But second, it's done so quickly and so haphazardly that it actually breeds enormous resentment amongst peasants because nobody's sure of who owns what land, and there's conflicts over the land, etc. And the Wang Mang experiment ends in 25 CE. And the Han Dynasty comes back and basically reasserts the power of the aristocratic families. And so in both the Roman and the Han cases, there's enormous tension between those who own land and are fantastically wealthy because of it, and those who are small farmers or who don't own land and rent it, or who own just a small piece of land. And one of the reasons for this increasing tension is that, as I'll talk about this later, that the dynamic of the economy over time tends to allow the wealthy to buy more land and get wealthier, whereas the poor, if they screw up once and they go bankrupt, they lose their land forever. It gets bought usually by the patricians or by the aristocrats. And so there's a constant sort of pressure that the big landowners tend to get more and more land over time, and the poor tend to get less and less access to land over time. So this economic inequality, especially in land ownership, is a permanent source of tension and therefore a permanent source of instability in the Roman Empire and in the Han Dynasty, right? So in both of these cases, we see that disagreements over land ownership are a significant source of conflict that erupts periodically and necessitates the government sort of being more and more oppressive to keep the poor from revolting over land issues. Second big problem, taxation. I mentioned with the Roman Empire that patricians generally didn't allow themselves to be taxed, right? Patrician lands were not taxed, plebeian lands were taxed. And that meant that over time the government had problems because if it tried to raise taxes too much, it drove the poor into poverty, and the land got bought by patricians, and then it stopped being taxed. And so sort of like the higher they raised the taxes, the fewer people that were paying taxes because more land went into the hands of the patricians. And the patricians had enough clout to continually prevent any changes in the tax code that would allow them to be taxed. And so in any society, and you see this again just before the French Revolution, incidentally, we won't get there in this class, but in any society, when you start to see these massive disparities in wealth coupled with the idea that the government can't tax the super wealthy, then you start to see revolution on the horizon, right? And so Rome's tax dynamic, ultimately, you saw that the Gracchus brothers and whatever, and the way it got handled was the wealthy, the patricians, created an emperor with consolidated all authority and destroyed the democracy because they didn't want the poor to be able to impose taxation on the rich. The Han had the similar issue. The dynamic was slightly different, but aristocrats the government was imposing higher and higher taxes. In this case, part of what was going on was the government was trying to protect the Silk Road trade routes. They were building enormous fortresses and stationing armies along the trade routes to foster trade. But to pay for those, they were increasing taxes on poor farmers. And this led to a tax revolt called the Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184 and 185 BC, or CE, where basically peasants rose up and refused to pay the taxes necessary for paying for these new forts along the Silk Road, etc. And it was put down, but again, the government is having trouble, partly because it can't directly tax the super wealthy because they have too much political power. They can prevent themselves from being taxed. So the government is generally trying to squeeze more money out of the poor and the middle classes to pay for things. And the more they squeeze, the more resistance they run into. And so in both cases, the tax dynamic weakens the empire. There's also, both empires see significant internal strife. When you consolidate political power so tightly into one emperor, what you see is that influence over that emperor and access to that emperor, if you can talk to the emperor, you can make huge changes happen. And so people start fighting over access to the emperor. And because there's no official thing like an election that would allow you to decide who's going to get to make decisions or be close to the emperor, it becomes lots of scheming and under the table stuff and conspiracies and things like that. And you start to see factions emerge. In Rome, you saw factions emerge around the emperor, and a number of emperors wound up getting assassinated. The Praetorian Guard, who were the Roman guards who protected the emperor, became really important political players because they could assassinate an emperor if they didn't like him, and they could decide who got close to the emperor, so who got to talk to the emperor. So you start to see factions like that. And you see factions in the Senate each trying to control who has access to the emperor, etc., with lots of infighting. And when an emperor died, you would often see like open fighting for a while between different factions deciding who gets to be the next emperor. In the Han Dynasty, it had a slightly different dynamic. In the Han Dynasty, the emperor had a whole series of wives and concubines to produce heirs, but the emperor wanted to make sure that nobody else was having sex with any of his wives and concubines. And so the Han Dynasty had the habit of using eunuchs, who were men who had been castrated, as guards and administrators in the emperor's household. Well, these eunuchs are therefore just members of the emperor's household, but because they're the servants and the record keepers to the emperor, they have access to all sorts of information, and they have access to the emperor himself, and so they have enormous influence in the politics around the emperor. But the Han Dynasty also set up this massive bureaucracy of official bureaucrats, governors of provinces and prefects, etc., And so those people have enormous power, but they also want access to the emperor. And the eunuchs and the bureaucrats have profoundly different goals and ways of operating. And so you start to see infighting around the emperor between the eunuchs who want influence and control and wealth, and the bureaucrats who want influence and control, and wealth for that matter. And so you see often violent clashes between eunuchs and the bureaucrats. In fact, in 189 CE, a few years after the Yellow Turban Rebellion, in 189, a group of bureaucrats basically starts a riot, a pogrom against the eunuchs of the palace, and over 2,000 eunuchs are murdered in one big massacre in 189. So in both these cases, internal factions, the Praetorian Guard, or even if you think about the barracks emperors, the military, get involved in sort of internal infighting in the government, or in the Han Dynasty case between bureaucrats and eunuchs. There's internal fighting in the government, which weakens the government. And this internal fighting is in many ways the result of the fact that power simply resides with the single emperor. And so access to that emperor, there's no official route for access to the emperor. There's no official way of deciding who has influence on the emperor. So instead you get all this infighting and conspiracy and influence and peddling influence, etc. The last thing that both these empires suffered from was external barbarians, right? That on the edges of these empires, you had semi-sedentary peoples who did some farming, but also did a lot of pastoralism, raised animals, moved around a lot. They were nomadic often. In China, it's the Xiongnu, who lived in northwestern China, Central Asia. And in Rome, of course, the Germanic tribes and the Goths just outside of the empire, and then later the Huns. But in both cases, these external barbarians are not really a problem if the empire is functioning correctly, if the empire is functioning well. If the empire is functioning well, if it can raise enough taxes, it can pay for standing armies to protect its borders. And these nomadic peoples are generally not well enough organized to put together a big enough force to actually threaten the empire. But when the tax problems and the economic inequalities start to weaken the empire, and when the infighting within the government start to weaken that empire, that opens the door to external peoples pushing in harder. And we saw this with the Roman Empire in today's lecture, that once these people start getting their foot in the door, the government has to increase its resources dedicated to defending, but that involves raising taxes, which can set off a new set of conflicts over taxation and economic inequality, and it can often set off internal factions, the barracks emperors, etc., fighting with each other under this pressure. And so the external peoples are rarely the sole cause of the fall of an empire. It's rather that they put pressure on an empire, and if the empire has weaknesses in its tax system and economic inequality and internal factions, then that external pressure becomes one more thing pushing it to collapse. And as we see, both the Han and the Roman empires do collapse. And essentially the thing that knocks them off in the end is these external barbarians, but that's only because these other factors had weakened those empires beforehand, right? So if in the largest sense, what we can see then is that there are some serious dynamics with these classical empires. The first is that they're getting wealthy enough with enough trade and they're getting large enough governments, etc., that they've actually set up a system that tends to increase economic inequality over time. There tends to be an internal dynamic that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and this sets up all sorts of problems with taxation, etc. But also just the size of these empires. They're big, right? They've got a lot of territory they have to protect. And so the costs of defending that territory with standing armies become enormous. And if you don't have your tax system in place and your economic inequality is undermining things, it gets harder and harder to defend those borders. And then, of course, you get the external pressures. So one of the things we can see with these classical empires is that the classical empires are in some ways a quantum leap above the earlier empires. in that they're way bigger, they're way better organized, they have standardized currencies, they have a whole, better infrastructure. There's a lot of things that allow them to succeed, but they still do not have the types of communication and government structures that would allow them to last indefinitely, because they have these sort of internal dynamics between economic inequality, taxation issues, defending against external invaders that they haven't quite figured out how to solve yet. And so we'll see that after the classical era, you're going to get new innovations and bigger empires, and other things like gunpowder will have an enormous effect later. But we'll talk about that in later lectures.